I must talk to the senators. I need their counsel. Wait, Gaius and Falco. Excellent. What else is dusted?
Not yet.
No, they would walk around eating, not painting. You sold me queer giraffes. I want my money back. Not a chance.
To you for the next few days, which will be the last of your miserable lives, than that bitch of a mother that brought you screaming into this world. I did not pay good money for you for your company.
Favor you. Red is the god's color. You will need their help today.
Welcome back to the Fame Box. If you're new here, genuinely pull up a seat because this channel is built for people exactly like you. People who don't just watch films, people who feel them, people who pause, rewind, and sit with a scene long after it's over, trying to figure out exactly what just happened to them. That's who this is for. And today we're opening a box that a lot of people think they already know. A box that has been sitting on the shelf for over 2 decades now. collecting dust under a thick layer of cultural mythology. People say it's a classic, people say it's a masterpiece. And here at the Film Box, we don't take anybody's word for anything, not even the word of 25 years of consensus. So today, we're going in fresh, we're going layer by layer. We're going to look at what this film does brilliantly, what it gets genuinely wrong, and what it's actually trying to say underneath all that sand and blood and spectacle. The box is right here. Let's open it together. Now, before we go any further, I want to be honest with you from the very start because that's what this channel is built on. Gladiator is one of the most beloved films of its generation. It won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. It made Russell Crowe a superstar. It reignited an entire genre that Hollywood had all but abandoned. And I sat down with all of that weight on my shoulders, all of that expectation, all of that cultural reverence, and I came away with the film that I respect enormously in some places and feel genuinely frustrated by in others. My personal rating is 5.8 out of 10, and by the time we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why, and you might even disagree with me, which I hope you do, because that conversation in the comments is the whole point. So, let's talk about Gladiator. Here is the thing about this film that most people completely skip past. Here is the detail that changes how you see every single choice Ridley Scott made. When production on Gladiator began in 1999, there was no finished script. Not a draft that everyone was happy with, not even close. The film went into principal photography with an incomplete story, and what followed was one of the most chaotic, creatively fractured, and yet somehow miraculously successful productions in modern Hollywood history. That's the box we're opening today. A film that arguably should not have worked. A film that was held together by the sheer gravitational force of a few extraordinary performances and a director who knew exactly what images he wanted to put on screen, even when nobody could quite agree on the words that went with them. How did this film end up winning Best Picture? How did it become the film that defined an era? And does it still hold up when you take the mythology away and look at it clearly? Let's find out. But before we get into the story, before we even meet Maximus and Commodus and the blood-soaked sand of the arena, I want to take you behind the lens first. Because at the Film Box, we believe you should understand how the box was built before you open it. And the building of this particular box is one of the most fascinating stories in Hollywood filmmaking. Let's start with the script, because everything about Gladiator begins and ends with the script. According to multiple interviews and behind-the-scenes accounts, the screenplay went through an extraordinary number of revisions before and during production. The original concept came from a painting, reportedly a specific work depicting a gladiator standing in an arena, victorious but somehow alone, and producer Douglas Wick was so struck by the image that he commissioned a story around it. That image became the emotional DNA of the entire film, but translating that feeling into a workable screenplay proved genuinely difficult. Writers David Franzoni, John Logan, and William Nicholson all made contributions at different stages, and reportedly key scenes were still being rewritten on set, sometimes the night before filming. What's remarkable is that this creative turbulence didn't produce a disjointed mess. It produced a film with a very clear emotional core and a somewhat uneven narrative shell around it. That tension between the powerful central feeling and the occasionally shaky story logic around it is something you can feel when you watch Gladiator closely, and it explains a lot. The second production detail you need to know about is Russell Crowe's relationship with the script throughout the shoot. According to various accounts from the production period, Crowe was reportedly not satisfied with the written material at many points during filming and pushed back consistently on dialogue and character choices. Rather than being a source of conflict, this tension apparently produced something interesting. Crowe found ways to communicate Maximus through silence and physical presence in moments where the written lines weren't landing for him. Some of the most powerful moments in this film are moments where Russell Crowe says almost nothing, where he stands still and lets his face do something that no screenwriter put on a page. That wasn't an accident, That was a performer working in real time to fill the gaps in a script that was still finding itself. When you watch those quiet moments in the film now knowing this context, they hit completely differently. Now, here is a production detail that carries genuine weight, and it's one that every serious film lover should know. Oliver Reed, who plays the slave trader and gladiatorial trainer Proximo, died of a heart attack in Malta during the production of Gladiator. He passed away on May 2, 1999, before he had completed all of his scenes. The production team faced an almost impossible creative and ethical challenge. How do you finish a film when one of your key performers is gone? The solution, handled reportedly with enormous care and in consultation with Reed's family, involved using existing footage, digital face replacement technology, and a body double to complete Proximo's arc. What is so striking when you know this is how present Reed feels in the finished film? His performance radiates a kind of gruff, wounded humanity. A man who sold his own freedom in installments and never quite forgave himself for it, and the seams of that digital completion are almost invisible. It stands as one of the most thoughtful and technically remarkable posthumous performances in cinema history. And it adds a layer of melancholy to every single scene Proximo appears in because you're watching a real man's final work. The fourth thing you need to understand before you watch a single frame of this film is how Ridley Scott approached the visual world of ancient Rome. Scott has spoken in interviews about his determination to make Rome feel genuinely alien to a modern audience. Not the clean, white toga and columns Rome of the old Hollywood epics, but something dirtier, more textured, more real. The production design team, led by Arthur Max, reportedly studied archaeological records, ancient art, and even graffiti from Pompeii to create environments that felt lived in and specific. The Colosseum sequences present a particularly fascinating case. The actual physical set built for the film was only about a third of the full structure, primarily the lower tiers of seating and the arena floor. The rest, the soaring upper decks, the crowds of 50,000, the sheer overwhelming scale of the place, was created through a combination of digital effects and miniature work. And the reason it still looks so convincing today is that Scott and his visual effects team grounded everything in real physical space first. The digital extension had something genuine to attach to. You can feel the weight of the physical set underneath the digital world around it. And that combination is why the arena sequences still carry genuine presence. And the fifth production layer, the one that might matter most to how the film feels emotionally, is the score. Hans Zimmer and vocalist Lisa Gerrard created the music for Gladiator, and the story of how that collaboration developed is worth understanding. Gerard's voice is not singing in any traditional language in this film. She is vocalizing in what she has described as her own personal language. Sounds and syllables that carry emotional meaning without lexical meaning. The result is a score that feels ancient and personal simultaneously. It doesn't sound like ancient Rome, it sounds like grief, like memory, like the specific feeling of something irretrievably lost. Zimmer and Gerard reportedly developed key musical themes before Ridley Scott had even finished editing the film, which means in some scenes the music came first and the picture was cut to match it. Now and We Are Free, the theme that runs through the film's most important emotional moments, was not composed to picture, it was composed to feeling. And when you understand that, you understand why the music in Gladiator doesn't just accompany the emotion on screen. It generates it. So that's the box we are working with, an incomplete script that somehow found its soul. A lead actor who filled the latent gaps with silence and presence. A posthumous performance preserved with digital care. A visual world built half in physical reality and half in a computer. And a score that bypassed language entirely and went straight for the heart. Now, let's open the box itself. Gladiator was released in May of the year 2000, directed by Ridley Scott and produced by DreamWorks Pictures and Universal Pictures. It stars Russell Crowe as Maximus Decimus Meridius, a Roman general at the height of his power who loses everything in a single night and spends the rest of the film trying to either reclaim something or destroy himself in the attempt, depending on how you read his psychology. Joaquin Phoenix plays Commodus, the Emperor's son, who becomes the Emperor through an act of moral cowardice, and then wears power like clothing that doesn't fit and slowly drives him mad. Connie Nielsen plays Lucilla, Commodus' sister, and a figure of genuine political complexity in a film that doesn't always make room for her. Richard Harris plays the aging Emperor Marcus Aurelius, present only briefly but powerfully. And Derek Jacobi and Jimon Hoso fill out a supporting cast that is in several places significantly better than the script they've been given. At its heart, this is a revenge film. That's the simple truth of it. Maximus wants to kill Commodus. Everything else, the political intrigue, the gladiatorial spectacle, the philosophical underpinning about honor and Roman legacy, exists in orbit around that central gravitational pull. And the film works best when it leans fully into that primal engine and stops trying to be more sophisticated than it actually is. It works least well when it gestures toward complexity it hasn't actually built. But we'll get to that. The film's genesis reportedly connects to a genuine creative frustration with Hollywood at the turn of the millennium. The epic historical film had largely disappeared from mainstream cinema after decades of diminishing returns. The genre was considered box office poison. Sand and Zandu's films were the punchline of a joke, not the content of a serious pitch meeting. When Douglas Wick brought the concept to Ridley Scott, what he was proposing was not just a film but a reclamation, a statement that the epic could still work if it was told with the visual ambition and psychological intensity of modern filmmaking rather than the staginess of the old studio productions. Scott's entire career had been built on exactly that kind of ambition. He was a director of Alien and Blade Runner films that created worlds so fully imagined and so visually dense that you could almost smell them. Bringing that sensibility to ancient Rome was, on paper, a genuinely exciting prospect, and in many ways the film delivers on it completely. Should you watch Gladiator if you haven't seen it? Yes, absolutely. Before I give you my rating and my criticisms, I want to be clear that this is a film that earns its place in the conversation about great cinema even when it falls short of its own ambitions. There are sequences in this film that are genuinely extraordinary. There is a performance at the center of it that carries a weight I did not expect. There is a villain in Joaquin Phoenix's Commodus who is one of the most psychologically complex antagonists in mainstream Hollywood history. For all my reservations about where the film falls short, and I have real reservations, it is worth your time, it rewards attention, and it has things to say that he will still be thinking about after the credits roll. But let me tell you what it felt like to sit down with this film. Because the first watch experience of Gladiator is its own distinct thing, and it matters. I came into Gladiator carrying the weight of its reputation. 25 years of people telling me it's a masterpiece tends to do something to your expectations. I was prepared for a film that was going to overwhelm me emotionally and cinematically. I was ready to be simply swept away. And what I got in the first 10 minutes was something more complicated and, frankly, more interesting than I expected. The film opens in Germania, and immediately visually it announces itself. The color palette is cold, blues and grays and the dying gold of autumn wheat fields. The Roman army is massed and waiting, armored and tense, and the anticipation in those frames is almost physical. You can feel the cold in those images even sitting in a warm room watching a screen. Ridley Scott doesn't ease you in. He puts you directly into the geography of violence and asks you to orient yourself in real time, and then the battle begins, and it is extraordinary, not in a clean, choreographed way, in a chaotic, loud, viscerally disorienting way that makes you feel like you are standing in the middle of it rather than watching it from a comfortable distance. The editing is deliberate in its abruptness, quick cuts that deny you the satisfaction of seeing any one moment fully. Fire arrows, broken shields, screaming horses, mud, close quarters. It's a battle sequence designed to make you feel the fear of it as much as the spectacle of it, and it succeeds. I walked in expecting a polished epic. I expected a certain kind of grandeur, the kind you can lean back and admire from a distance. And in those first 10 minutes, the film gave me something rawer and more immediate than that. It gave me a general in the mud who clearly loves the men under his command and who fights not from behind but alongside them. And it gave me Russell Crowe, who I expected to admire but did not expect to believe. I believed him immediately. That surprised me. In those opening minutes, the weight of a man carrying everything, his duty, his love for his family far from the battlefield, his exhaustion, his discipline, is so completely present that the character establishes himself before he has spoken more than a handful of lines. What hooked me in those first 10 minutes was not the spectacle. The spectacle was impressive but expected. What hooked me was the feeling that this man, Maximus, was operating under a burden so enormous that the whole film was going to be about watching him carry it or watching it crush him. That tension, that sense of a human being at maximum capacity before the story has even really started. That's what made it impossible to look away. And then the film pivots. Marcus Aurelius calls Maximus to his tent. An old man speaks quietly to a younger one about Rome and power and what comes after. And everything slows down and gets intimate and almost unbearably weighted. Because both men in that scene know something is about to change, even if only one of them knows exactly what. And that quietness, after the roar of the battle, is where the film first shows you its real intention. This is not going to be just about combat. This is going to be about what a man is made of when the structure of his life is ripped away from him. That was the moment the film had me. Not the battle, the quiet conversation in a tent. And that tells you something important about what Gladiator is actually doing and what it's attempting to say. So the box is open, the lid is off, and now we go inside, properly, fully, without rushing, because this is a film that deserves to be walked through slowly, scene by scene, beat by beat, with real attention paid to why things happen and not just what happens. That's the difference between watching Gladiator and understanding Gladiator, and that's exactly what we're here to do. Let's go back to that tent. Because everything in this film, every twist, every loss, every moment of violence and grief and desperate determination begins in that one quiet conversation between Marcus Aurelius and Maximus. The old emperor is dying and he knows it. He carries that knowledge the way old men carry old injuries. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but as a settled weight in the body. Richard Harris plays Marcus Aurelius in this film with an economy that is genuinely beautiful to watch. He doesn't grandstand, he doesn't perform dying. He simply inhabits a man who has thought very hard about what he is and what he leaves behind, and who has arrived at a conclusion that frightens him. And the conclusion is this: his son Commodus is not fit to lead Rome. He knows it. He has probably known it for years. And he has been unable to say it out loud because saying it out loud would require him to fully reckon with what his love for his son has cost him in terms of honest judgment. What Marcus Aurelius asks of Maximus in that tent is extraordinary. He asks him, a soldier, a man of the provinces, not of Rome's political machinery, to take temporary control of the empire after his death, to give power back to the Senate, to restore the Republic. It is an act of profound political idealism from a man who has lived long enough to know that idealism is almost never rewarded. And the reason he asks Maximus rather than his own blood is the most quietly devastating thing the film says in its first half hour. He tells Maximus that he is the son he should have had, that Rome is about more than one family's ambition, that what Rome needs is not a Caesar, but a servant. Now, here's what most people miss in that scene, and this is the layer underneath the scene that the film plants early and never quite acknowledges explicitly. Maximus doesn't want this. Not really. Not deep down. He wants his farm in Spain. He wants his wife and his son. He wants to plant wheat and live quietly and be done with the machinery of empire. He accepts Marcus Aurelius' request not because he is ambitious, but because he is fundamentally incapable of refusing a man he loves and respects. And that incapacity, that inability to choose himself over duty, is the engine of his entire tragedy. Everything that happens to Maximus happens not because he is powerful, but because he is loyal. Loyalty in this film is not a virtue, it is a wound. And then there is Commodus. Commodus enters this story the way all the most interesting villains enter stories, not as a monster, but as a wound. Joaquin Phoenix walks into that tent to meet his father, and you can see everything about this character in the first 30 seconds of his presence. The hunger, the need, the performance of ease that is covering something raw and more desperate underneath. Commodus wants his father to love him. That's it. That's the whole of this character at his foundation. He wants to be seen by a man who has spent his son's entire life measuring him against an ideal he cannot reach. Marcus Aurelius tells Commodus directly, gently but directly, that he does not have the virtues of a true Caesar, not wisdom, not justice, not fortitude, not temperance. He lists them, he names them. And then he lists what Commodus does have. And what he has is love and obedience and a capacity for compassion, qualities that are genuinely good but that are not the architecture of empire. Watch Phoenix in that scene. Watch what happens to his face as his father speaks. There is a moment, a specific, brief, shattering moment where you can see the child behind the man, the boy who wanted his father's approval more than he wanted anything else in the world, and who has just been told in the gentlest possible terms that he will never have it. What follows from that moment is the act that sets the entire film in motion. Commodus embraces his father, and in that embrace, in that moment of apparent tenderness, he takes from Marcus Aurelius the only thing he has left to take. He smothers the old man. He ends his father's life, not in rage, but in a kind of terrible, bottomless grief. It is an act simultaneously of murder and of love, and that ambiguity is the most sophisticated thing this film ever does. Commodus kills his father because his father would not give him Rome. But also, and this is the layer that stays with you, he kills his father because his father would not give him unconditional love. The empire and the love are the same thing in Commodus's psychology. To be denied one is to be denied both, and so he takes them. He reaches out and closes the gap between wanting and having with his own hands, in the dark, in an embrace that looks like grief, but is actually the final act of a man who has decided that the world must rearrange itself around his need. That is the moment the film sets its real story in motion, not the battle in Germania, not the arrival of the armies. This quiet act of violence in a tent, in the dark, between a father and a son who failed each other in different ways. Everything that follows is aftermath. Commodus comes out of that tent with his father's blood on his hands and power in his grip, and the first thing he does is move against Maximus. He cannot afford a man who knows what he did. He cannot afford a man who carries Marcus Aurelius's final wishes as a mandate. And perhaps most of all, and this is psychologically rich territory the film gestures toward but never fully excavates, he cannot afford a man who was loved by his father more than he was. Maximus represents everything Commodus was told he was not: discipline, honor, the respect of soldiers, the love of a father who gave it without political calculation. Destroying Maximus is not just strategic, it is the completion of something that began in that tent. So Commodus orders Maximus's arrest and the execution of his family. And here is where the film makes its boldest and most painful narrative choice. It does not show you the family's death directly, it shows you the aftermath. Maximus escapes his executioners, barely wounded, running through dark forest on a horse that is dying under him. And he rides to the night and the day and into the next night, driven by a desperation that is almost beyond reason. And when he arrives at his farm in Spain, he is already too late. The wheat is burned, the house is ash, and what he finds there is so specifically depicted and so deliberately restrained that the grief lands like a stone dropping into still water, silent, heavy, spreading. The film could have given you a graphic depiction of the violence done to his family. It chose not to, and that choice is correct. It is the right instinct, handled with genuine sensitivity, Because what the camera focuses on is not the act of destruction but its residue, the detail of what was lost rather than the spectacle of how it was taken. And what Maximus does in that moment, how he reacts, is one of the purest pieces of physical acting in Russell Crowe's career. He does not wail, he does not collapse theatrically. He touches what remains with his hands. He is a man whose entire body has received a wound from which it will not recover, and he expresses it through the simplest possible physical gesture. The hands of a man reaching for something that is not there. That image does more emotional work than 10 pages of written dialogue could have done. And then the desert. Maximus collapses from his wounds on the road back through North Africa and is found by slavers, men who deal in human beings the way merchants deal in livestock, with detached professional assessment. He is evaluated not as a person but as a commodity. His body assessed for its usefulness, his potential marketability calculated. It is a deliberate and jarring shift in register. We have just watched a man at the apex of Roman power lose everything and be brought to his knees by grief. And now the world receives him with commercial indifference. The universe Gladiator is saying very clearly at this point, does not care about your tragedy. Life continues on the terms of people who have power over you, not on the terms of your grief. That's a hard and honest thing for a mainstream Hollywood action film to say, and the film says it without flinching. He is taken to Zucavar, a provincial Roman city in North Africa, and sold to a man named Proximo. And this is where Oliver Reed enters the film, and where the film gains something it cannot entirely account for in its screenplay. Reed's Proximo is a man who was once himself a gladiator, who fought in the Colosseum under Marcus Aurelius and was granted his freedom by the emperor himself, and who has spent the years since managing other men's fights while quietly hating himself for the bargain he made with his own dignity. He runs his gladiatorial school not with the cruelty of a simple oppressor, but with the jaded authority of a man who has already made every calculation and found the sum depressing. He is not kind, but he is honest, and in this film, honesty functions almost as a form of kindness, by contrast with almost everything else around it. Proximo's first assessment of Maximus is clinical and dismissive. He sees a wounded, broken man who hasn't eaten properly in days, and who carries grief the way a drowning man carries water. Everywhere, all through him. He doesn't see potential, he sees trouble. And then Maximus is put in the arena for the first time, a small provincial arena, nothing like the Colosseum, rough and loud and immediate, and everything changes. Because Maximus doesn't fight like a gladiator, he fights like a general. He assesses, he positions, he communicates with the men fighting beside him, slaves and prisoners who have no reason to trust each other. And within minutes he has organized them into something resembling a military unit. He wins not just through individual skill but through tactical intelligence. And Proximo, watching from the stand, sees something he hasn't seen in a long time, someone who might actually be worth investing in. There's a conversation between them that the film handles well. Proximo tells Maximus something that the film uses as a kind of philosophical key. He explains that to win the crowd is to win your freedom, that the arena is theater as much as combat. That survival is not enough. You have to make them love you. Because a crowd that loves you is a crowd that protects you, and the crowd that protects you is leverage. This is cynical wisdom. It is the wisdom of a man who bought his freedom at the cost of his pride and has been managing that transaction ever since. But it is also, in the context of this story, genuinely useful. And Maximus receives it the way he receives almost everything in this film, quietly, watchfully, filing it away with the same discipline he applies to everything else. What is fascinating psychologically about Maximus in this section of the film is the question of whether he actually wants to live. His family is gone. His purpose, the mandate from Marcus Aurelius, is in ruins. He is a slave. Everything he was, everything that defined him has been stripped away or destroyed. So why does he survive? Why does he fight? The film doesn't answer this explicitly, which is actually one of its more interesting restraints. You could read Maximus as a man driven by revenge, and that reading is supported by plenty of evidence throughout the film. But you could also read him as a man who fights because fighting is all he has left, not purpose. Habit. The body's refusal to stop doing what it knows. A soldier without a war who becomes a gladiator not out of choice, but because the machinery of survival has only one gear left, and that gear is violence. That ambiguity is more interesting than a clean revenge narrative would have been, and the film maintains it better than you might expect. The friendship that develops between Maximus and Juba, played by Jimon Hansu with a warmth and quiet dignity that the film sometimes takes for granted, is one of the most genuinely human relationships in the movie. Juba is a Numidian hunter who was also taken into slavery, and his presence alongside Maximus functions as something more than narrative companionship. He is a man who has his own losses, his own family he is separated from, his own reasons for grief. And the film uses their relationship to say something quite specific about how human beings endure the unendurable, not through grand gestures of defiance, but through small, consistent acts of witness, being present for each other, acknowledging each other's pain without trying to fix it. Juba's quiet observation of Maximus, his understanding of what the man has lost before he is ever told directly, is one of the most tender things in this film, and Juan so delivers it with a subtlety that the film does not always reward with equivalent writing in return. There is a scene in the training grounds of Proximo's establishment. At night, Maximus, alone with the small figurines of his wife and son that he carved or kept, his only physical connection to what he has lost, that the film returns to several times. Each time it carries different weight. Early in the story, it is about grief, the private maintenance of love in a place where love has no structural support. Later, it is about memory as identity. Maximus holding on to those figurines as a way of holding on to who he was before Rome took everything. And near the end, it becomes about promise. The promise of a reunion that may only be possible in death. It is a simple visual motif, almost mundanely simple, and the film uses it with more consistency and emotional intelligence than it uses almost any of its larger narrative machinery. The gladiatorial games in the provinces are depicted as rough, immediate, unglamorous affairs, and this contrast with what comes later in Rome is deliberate and important. The provincial arena in Jutabal has none of the spectacle and architecture of the Colosseum. It is a dirt oval surrounded by wooden stands, crowded with local residents who want entertainment and release. The violence here is closer, uglier, and more obviously linked to desperation than to performance, and yet Maximus applies himself to it with the same methodical discipline he applied to warfare. He wins. Consistently, convincingly, and each victory adds to a growing reputation that eventually reaches the ears of people who can place him in a much larger arena. The decision to send Proximus gladiators to Rome to fight in the newly reopened Colosseum under the reign of Commodus is presented in the film as a commercial opportunity for Proximo and a political maneuver by Commodus. The new emperor wants to use the games to buy public love. It is one of the oldest political calculations in history. Give the people spectacle and they will forgive you almost anything. Proximo, who knows what the Colosseum is and what it demands and what it costs, takes the opportunity anyway, because he is a businessman. And because in a way the film is careful not to make too explicit, he recognizes in Maximus something of himself, a man who might use the arena as more than an arena, who might use it as a door. The arrival in Rome is one of the film's genuine visual achievements. Scott and his production design team deliver on the promise of the opening production context I gave you. This Rome is overwhelming in scale, dense with humanity, loud and colorful and morally confused, a city that is simultaneously the height of civilization and a machine for producing spectacular violence. The Colosseum sequences in Rome are where the film's visual ambition fully materializes. The digital extension of the arena is so well integrated with the physical sets that even now, In an era where digital filmmaking is considerably more advanced, those shots retain an almost physical credibility. You believe in the weight of 50,000 people. You believe in the stone and the sand and the light. And crucially, you believe in the stakes. Which is remarkable because by this point in a film about ancient Rome released in the year 2000, you might reasonably expect to have been numbed by spectacle. The film earns your continued attention because it keeps the human drama at the center even as the visual scale expands. The first Colosseum sequence, the reenactment of the Battle of Carthage, is where the film delivers what might be its single most satisfying action sequence. The premise is simple and ingenious. A group of gladiators, Maximus among them, are placed in the arena to play the role of Carthaginian soldiers who are supposed to be defeated by a superior force of Roman warriors. It is scripted entertainment, a foregone conclusion, history performed for applause. And what Maximus does with that setup, the speed and intelligence with which he reorganizes the men around him, reads the tactical situation, and turns a scripted defeat into an absolute rout, is both thrilling as action and revealing as character. He cannot help being a general. Even in an arena designed for theater, he imposes military logic on chaos. The scene plays as spectacle, but it functions as a character revelation. This man cannot be reduced to performance. He is incapable of playing the loser even when the loser is the part he has been assigned. And then, in the aftermath of that reversal, standing in the smoke and the silence and the stunned crowd, comes the moment. The question, the single line of dialogue that has become one of the most referenced moments in this film's cultural life. Maximus, surrounded by the men who just followed him to victory, turns to the crowd and asks whether they are not entertained. And it is one of those moments in film where you can feel the whole story turning on a single axis, because the question is not triumphant, it is bitter. It is the question of a man who finds the arena, the crowd, the applause, the spectacle of it all, genuinely contemptible. He has just saved his own life and the lives of the men with him, and the crowd is roaring with delight, and he is furious. Not at them exactly, at the situation, at the world has taken a general and made him an entertainer, at the machinery of empire that has reduced the complexity of a human being to the question of whether he can hold a crowd. The bitterness in that moment is real and it is layered, and it is, in its way, the most honest thing the film ever says about its own genre. Commodus is in the imperial box watching, and then Maximus removes his helmet, and the two men see each other. This is the moment that the film has been building toward since the tent, since the embrace in the dark, since everything, and the way Scott holds it. The slow recognition, the disbelief, the fear, the rage moving across Commodus's face in the specific order that tells you his psychology has not changed, that he is still the man who cannot bear to be confronted by a living reminder of what he lacks, is exactly right. This is the moment the box opens completely. Commodus descends to the arena. He moves through the corridors and the guards and the protocol of power with the barely contained urgency of a man who cannot quite believe what he is seeing. And when he faces Maximus face to face for the first time since the tent, since the order to kill him and his family, what he wants is submission. He wants Maximus to kneel. He wants the man who was loved by his father to acknowledge his authority, and Maximus, in one of the most precisely calibrated pieces of acting in this entire film, gives him something else entirely. He gives him a name. He tells Commodus who he is, where he comes from, who his wife and his son were, and what was done to them. And he makes clear in the stillness and the control of his delivery that he is there to destroy him. No rage in the delivery, no performance, just the quiet announcement of a fact. And it is more frightening than any role could be. The political machinery of the film's second half now begins to turn. Lucilla, Commodus's sister, played by Connie Nielsen in a role that the film consistently underserves despite her genuine efforts with it, makes contact with Maximus. She was once his lover in a past that the film references but never fully fills in, and she is now navigating the imperial court with the precise carefulness of a woman who knows that her brother's instability makes her position more precarious with every passing week. She is allied with Senator Gragush, played by Derek Jacobi, with the compact authority of a man who has been watching empires rise and fall long enough to know exactly how they smell in the last stages of decay. And together they begin to construct a plan. Get Maximus out of the Colosseum. Get him to the legions in the north that were loyal to him. Use that military loyalty to topple Commodus. Here's where the film's narrative mechanics become genuinely strained, and where the incomplete screenplay problem starts to show its teeth. The political conspiracy in Gladiator is the weakest structural element in the film's story architecture. Not because it's implausible exactly, but because it's insufficiently dramatized. We are told there is a plan. We are shown the broad outlines of the plan. But the actual mechanics, the specific steps, the real risks, the human relationships that make the plan possible are sketched rather than rendered. Gracchus is a compelling presence, but a thin character. The Senate's position in relation to Commodus is established economically but not complexly. And Lucilla, who should be the most fascinating figure in this political labyrinth, a woman with genuine power and genuine grief, navigating the court of a dangerously unstable brother while trying to protect a son and manage a political conspiracy, is given perhaps half the screen time and a quarter of the character development she deserves. But let's stay with the story and come back to what falls short in a moment, because the middle section of this film, for all its structural weaknesses, contains some of its most emotionally rich material. Maximus is fighting in the Colosseum regularly now, and something is happening in the crowds. They are not just watching him fight, they are responding to something in him, an authenticity, a realness, a sense that here is a man who is not performing for them, who is not feeding the machine of spectacle willingly, who would rather be anywhere else, and who fights not for applause but for reasons they cannot name but can feel. There is a sequence in the film where Commodus watches Maximus from the imperial box and realizes with genuine alarm that the crowd's loyalty to his entertainment has crossed into something more personal, more individual, more politically dangerous. They don't just enjoy watching Maximus fight, they have begun to love him. And in a city where public affection is the currency of power, that is a direct threat to Commodus's authority. The relationship between Commodus and the crowd, and Commodus and Maximus via the crowd, is one of the more interesting political dynamics in the film. Commodus is a man who cannot earn genuine love and knows it. He can manufacture popularity through the games, through bread distributions, through the theater of imperial generosity, but what Maximus generates in the crowd is not manufactured. It is not produced by strategy or spectacle. It simply happens despite the context of slavery and violence, because something about this man's presence communicates directly to something in the people watching him. And that is precisely what makes him dangerous. You cannot buy what Maximus has. You cannot legislate it or execute it away without making it stronger. Commodus understands this, and it drives him to a kind of desperate, creative cruelty. There is a sequence where Commodus arranges for Maximus to face a legendary gladiator. Tigress of Gaul, the only undefeated gladiator in Rome's history, and secretly releases tigers into the arena during their fight, making the already stacked odds even more brutal. This is Commodus at his most revealing. He wants Maximus dead, but he also wants the crowd's permission for that death. He wants to manufacture a situation in which Maximus fails and dies and the crowd consents to it. He needs their validation even for the act of killing his enemy. The need for approval is so deep in this character that it shapes even his acts of violence. He cannot simply order Maximus killed in the arena. That would turn the crowd against him. He needs to create conditions where the death looks earned, where the crowd can feel they witnessed fair combat even when nothing about it was fair. That is the psychology of a man who has never been able to exist outside of other people's perception of him. And what happens instead? When Maximus wins despite the tigers, when he stands over the defeated tigers and refuses to deliver the killing blow, looking up at the crowd and then at Commodus is another pivot point. He gives the man his life, not because the crowd demanded it with thumbs up, because he chose to, because he is not the machine that Commodus needs him to be. Because even in an arena designed to strip him of every choice, he finds a choice to make and makes it on his own terms. The crowd erupts, and Commodus, watching from above, wearing the smile of a man who is burning inside, gives the thumbs up as though he decreed the decision himself, absorbing Maximus' act of defiance and repackaging it as his own magnanimity. It is a small, precise, brilliant moment of political theatre, and Joaquin Phoenix plays it with a control that is almost frightening. The net is tightening around the conspiracy now. Drusilla and Glaucus have laid the groundwork. Cicero, Maximus' old aide who has been waiting in Rome with the underground loyalists, is the link between the plan inside the city and the legions outside it. The idea is to get Maximus to the gates of the city on the night of a specific event, hand him a horse and a sword, and get him to his men. Simple, elegant, dependent on 100 things going exactly right, which of course they do not. Commodus discovers the conspiracy, and his discovery is the most disturbing scene in the film's second half, not because of any violence, but because of what it reveals about his relationship with his sister. He confronts Lucilla in her chambers with the specific intimacy of a man who has blurred lines that should never have been blurred, his love for her contaminated by the kind of possessiveness and jealousy and need that belongs nowhere near a sibling relationship. Phoenix plays these scenes with a physicality that is genuinely uncomfortable to watch, not in a gratuitous way, but in the way of something that is psychologically true about this character, which is that his damage has corroded the boundaries between kinds of love. He loves his sister with the same pathological need with which he loved his father. And when that love is threatened, when he learns she has been working against him, his response is not purely anger. It is a kind of devastated fury, the rage of a man who has been betrayed by the last person he trusted. He uses Lucilla's son, young Lucius, whom Maximus knew as a child, and who has clearly developed an attachment to the general he has been watching in the arena, as leverage. If Drusilla doesn't comply, if the conspiracy doesn't collapse, the boy suffers. And this is where the film puts Lucilla in an impossible position that it then, frustratingly, does not fully dramatize. She has to protect her son. She has to betray the conspiracy. She has to watch Commodus use her love for Lucius the same way he uses everything, as a tool, as leverage, as a mechanism for getting what he needs. And Nielsen is genuinely good in these scenes, finding the specific texture of a woman operating under impossible constraints with her face composed into careful neutrality, while everything behind it is raw with helplessness. But the film moves past her pain too quickly, back to Maximus, back to the conspiracy, back to the action, and she deserves more than the film gives her. Cicero is killed. He is used as bait to expose the conspiracy and then dispatched. A death that hits Maximus in the arena, watching from a distance, with the particular cruelty of a death you can see happening but cannot prevent. Crowe's reaction to that moment is played in profile, in the middle of a crowd, and it is entirely internal, a man absorbing a blow that cannot be answered, storing it with all the others, keeping the face still while something tightens further behind the eyes. Proximo, when he hears what is coming, makes the decision that defines his entire character. He opens the gates, he lets Maximus and Juba and the others go, and it costs him his life. Proximo is killed by Commodus' soldiers alone in his arena, and the moment of his death is handled with exactly the quiet respect that Oliver Reed's contribution to this film earned. The film does not linger on it, it does not make it spectacular. He simply disappears from the story in the way that people who give everything sometimes do, without the acknowledgement they deserve, in the middle of other people's larger stories. Maximus makes it, he almost reaches the gate, the horse, the road to the legions, But Commodus has him arrested before he can escape the city. And now there is nothing left, no plan, no conspiracy, no political solution. The only door still open is the last one, the arena, the final fight. Commodus decides that the only way to resolve this, the only way to regain full control of the narrative, is to fight Maximus himself in the Colosseum, in front of the people, and kill him with his own hands. It is the act of a man who has run out of every other tool and has arrived, finally, at the one he most feared and most desired, direct confrontation with the living proof of his inadequacy. But before that fight, in the holding cells beneath the Colosseum, Commodus visits Maximus. And here the film does something that is either brilliant or slightly too schematic, depending on how you read it. Commodus stabs Maximus in the side. Not enough to kill, just enough to ensure he enters the arena already dying. It is simultaneously a practical strategic move. Remove the physical advantage, and the act of a man who is so profoundly terrified of a fair contest that he cannot allow one to exist even in a context he controls entirely. Commodus rigs the fight even though he holds every other advantage. He is the emperor, surrounded by his guards, facing a slave in chains, and he still needs to cheat. That detail tells you everything about who this man is and has always been. Maximus enters the arena dying. He is already losing blood. His body, which has carried him through everything through Germania and Spain and North Africa and the provincial arenas and the Colosseum and grief and slavery and betrayal, is finally undeniably running out, and he fights anyway. He fights Commodus with everything left in him, and for most of the fight, Commodus is actually dominant, because for all his psychological damage, Commodus is not physically weak, and Maximus is wounded in a way that keeps compounding with every exchange. But then, in the detail that the film plans carefully and pays off correctly, Maximus gets a hand on the blade. The hidden blade. The one Commodus brought to finish what is started in the cells. And everything that the film has been building toward arrives in a single sustained exchange that is brutal and exhausted and somehow deeply sad. Maximus kills Commodus, not gloriously, not triumphantly, with everything left, and then the wound catching up with him, the body finally conceding, he collapses on the sand of the Colosseum. And he begins to see things. He sees the wheat field. He sees the wooden gate in the sun and the dust. He sees his son running toward him through the light. He sees his wife's hand. He sees everything he lost and everything he was promised and everything he's been moving toward without knowing it, and the vision has the quality of something that is simultaneously dream and arrival. The film holds that image, the golden light, the gate, the boy running, with a tenderness. That is, in all honesty, one of the most genuinely moving things it does. It is not subtle, it is not complicated, but it is honest. It is a film saying simply and clearly that this man has suffered enough and that the mercy he is given in death, the reunion, the return to the farm he never quite stopped reaching for, is not a consolation prize. It is the point. It was always the point. The arena was never the destination. The farm was. His final instructions, spoken barely audibly to those around him: restore Rome to the Senate, honor the promise he made to Marcus Aurelius, free the gladiators, are honored. And Juba, alone in the now empty Colosseum at night, buries the figurines of Maximus's wife and son in the sand where a man died. It is a small private act of love. No audience, no ceremony, just a man honoring a friend who is gone. And it is the right note to end on, for a film about a man whose entire worth was finally expressed not in the grandeur of Rome but in the small, irreducible humanity of his losses. That is the story of Gladiator. Now let's talk about what this film does with that story, brilliantly and otherwise. Let's start with what the film gets absolutely right, because there is real craft here and it deserves acknowledgement on its own terms before we get into what it misses. The single most extraordinary element of Gladiator is Joaquin Phoenix's performance as Commodus. And I want to spend real time with this because I think it is still genuinely undervalued in the conversation about great film villains. What Phoenix does with this character is not what you might expect from a story with such a cleanly defined good versus evil architecture. He does not play Commodus as a monster. He plays him as a man, a specific damaged psychologically coherent man whose monstrousness emerges directly from his wounds rather than existing as a pre-existing condition. Look closely at the scene early in the film where Commodus tells his father what virtues he does possess, the ones Marcus Aurelius failed to list. He speaks about his love for his father, his ability to be loyal, his desire to do well, and Phoenix plays it without self-pity and without irony. He means it, every word of it. Commodus is not lying in that moment. He is not performing. He is making a genuine, desperate, last-ditch argument that who he is has value even if it is not the value his father was looking for. And Marcus Aurelius' inability to respond with more than gentle firmness in that moment, his inability to say simply that his son is enough, is as damning of the father as it is of the son. Phoenix finds the humanity in that gap. He plays a man who has failed as much as he fails others, and then makes Commodus not just frightening but genuinely tragic in a way that Maximus, with his clean moral architecture, never quite is. There is a specific scene I want you to pay close attention to. The scene where Commodus goes to the Colosseum holding cells alone before the final fight and speaks to the dying Maximus. What Phoenix does in that scene is extraordinary. He is talking to a man he is about to fight to the death, a man he has spent the entire film trying to destroy. And what comes out of him is not victory speech. It is not gloating. What comes out is something closer to confession. He tells Maximus, and Phoenix delivers this in a register so quiet and unguarded that it reads almost as accidental truth, that he has always been compared to him, that he has always been found wanting, that even now, even with all the power in the world, the ghost of that comparison haunts him. He cannot escape the shadow of what Maximus represents, even at the moment of apparent triumph. That is a character who has been written with genuine psychological depth and performed with exceptional precision. The film does not always deserve Phoenix's Commodus, but it has him, and it is the better for it. Russell Crowe's performance is a different kind of achievement, and equally worthy of serious attention. I said earlier that Crowe fills the gaps in the script with silence and physical presence, and I want to be specific about what I mean, because it's not a vague compliment about charisma. What Crowe does is locate the grief in this man and then refuse to perform it. He does not play grief as emotion. He plays it as weight, as a specific physical quality of a person carrying something very heavy for a very long time. The posture, the stillness, the way he holds his jaw when he is absorbing information he does not want to receive. These are not utterly choices in the conventional sense. They are decisions about how a specific kind of man, with a specific kind of damage, inhabits a body. And they are profoundly convincing. The scene I would point to as the proof of Crowe's performance in this film is the scene after Maximus finds the ruins of his farm. He has ridden through night and day, wounded, terrified. He has arrived too late. He knows what he will find before he finds it. And the scene that follows, the tour of the ash and the wreckage, the discovery, the way he kneels in the dirt, is played with complete emotional honesty and complete technical control. There is a moment where he simply stops moving, where the forward momentum of grief, the searching, the reaching, the hoping against hope ceases, where the body accepts what the mind has known for hours. That stillness is not nothing. It is the specific stillness of a man who has just lost the last reason to continue. And Crowe holds it without flinching, without letting it become performance, without reaching for the camera's sympathy. He simply is in it. And that reality is more devastating than any amount of cinematic technique applied to the same moment could have been. The direction deserves its own careful look because Ridley Scott makes choices in this film that are genuinely artful even when the material around them is less than artful. The Germania battle sequence at the film's opening is a masterclass in experiential filmmaking. The deliberate use of undercranked camera movement, the close framing that denies you establishing shots, the way the editing refuses to let you find your bearings. It is designed not to be thrilling in the clean, pleasurable sense of Hollywood action filmmaking. It is designed to be frightening in the way that actual violence is frightening, because it happens faster than you can think, because you cannot see everything at once, because the information is insufficient for the situation. Scott has described wanting to make battle feel like what it feels like rather than what it looks like, and in that opening sequence he achieves it. The visual language of the film divides quite sharply between the cold blues and greens and yellows of the sequences outside Rome, Germania, Spain, North Africa, and the warmer, richer, more saturated golds and reds of Rome itself. This is not accidental. The world outside Rome has a rawness and a reality to it. The light is honest. The color is the color of actual weather and actual geography. Rome, by contrast, is excessive in its color, too rich, too warm, too golden, in a way that reads as gorgeous but also artificial. Rome in this film looks like power. It looks like the visual language of empire, and that excess, that almost too muchness, is a deliberate statement about what Rome is. It is a beautiful machine that processes human beings and produces spectacle. The color palette is the critique embedded in the cinematography. The Colosseum sequences are where Scott and his visual effects team achieve something technically remarkable, and I talked about this in the production context, but now that you've seen how the story uses those sequences, let me tell you what makes them work dramatically as well as visually. The key is scale. Not just the digital scale of 50,000 people in the stands, but the human scale within that vastness. Scott consistently frames Maximus in the arena in a way that emphasizes both his smallness in the space, the lone figure in all that sand, with all that stone above him, and his presence within it. The contrast between the figure and the space is doing emotional work throughout. This is a man who should be insignificant in this context, a slave, a prisoner, a commodity, and who is somehow more present, more real, more central than the empire of stone around him. That visual argument, individual human presence against institutional scale, is what the film is fundamentally about, and Scott makes it in almost every Colosseum frame. The score, as I mentioned in the production section, is fundamental to how this film creates emotion, and it cannot be overstated as a component of the film's success. Hans Zimmer's orchestral work is muscular and specific, matching the physical language of the action sequences with driving rhythmic urgency. But it is the collaboration with Lisa Gerrard that lifts the film above what it might have been without her. Her voice throughout the film's quieter sequences, the visions of the farm, the moments after loss, the sequences of memory, does something that is almost impossible to describe in technical terms. It removes language from grief. It finds the sonic shape of longing without words. And this is profoundly right for this story, because Maximus is not a man who processes loss through language. He is a man who carries it in his body, in his silence. Gerard's voice is the sound of that silence given form, and the score's central themes, particularly the motif that runs through the farm visions, the one that will eventually accompany his death, have a quality of accumulated emotional memory by the film's final act that is entirely the result of how carefully and consistently the music has been placed throughout. If I had to name one scene as the single most unforgettable moment in Gladiator, the one that stays, I would not choose the battle in Germania, though it is spectacular. I would not choose the reveal in the Colosseum, though it is dramatically precise. I would choose the moment after Cicero's death. The moment where Maximus, standing in the arena, watches a man who served and loved him be killed, at a distance as a direct consequence of his own attempt to escape. Crowe plays it in profile. Barely, the camera is far enough away that the expressions are almost unreadable. And yet the information registers, the slight drop in the body, the compression of something in the face, the second of total stillness before the fight continues. It is a performance of grief received in public, in a context where grief cannot be expressed, and it is delivered with such specific precision that it communicates more clearly than almost any other moment in the film. It is one of the most economical and devastating pieces of acting I have seen in a mainstream Hollywood film, and it is characteristically achieved not through scale or drama, but through restraint and control. Now, let's talk about where the film falls short, because it does fall short in specific places, and being honest about those places is part of what it means to take this film seriously. The most significant failure in Gladiator is what the film does, or rather what it fails to do with Lucilla. Connie Nielsen is a compelling performer with genuine intelligence and emotional range, and the character of Lucilla as written contains the seeds of something genuinely fascinating. Here is a woman who has survived at the court of a dangerous, unstable emperor who is also her brother, who carries the memory of a love that was taken from her, Maximus, the general who was once hers and who has now returned as a slave, who has a son whose safety depends on her navigating the imperial court without a single mistake, who is the only person with real access to both the political machinery and the human heart of this story. That character, written fully, would be one of the great female characters in mainstream historical cinema. Instead, Lucilla is given fragments of scenes and then parked in the corner while the men around her conduct their business. She has approximately 4 or 5 meaningful scenes in a nearly 3-hour film. She is given just enough to gesture at her complexity without being given enough to fully inhabit it. And that is a failure of the screenplay. A failure that is particularly noticeable because the film keeps returning to her as though it knows she matters, keeps putting the camera on Nielsen's face as though it knows there is something happening there worth capturing, and then keeps moving on before it has captured it. The second meaningful criticism is the political conspiracy in the film's second half. The Senate subplot, Gracchus, the senators, the question of Rome's political future, is handled with a breadth that the film hasn't earned in depth. We are supposed to feel that Rome's future hangs on this conspiracy, that the choice between imperial autocracy and senatorial republic is a genuine moral question with real stakes. But the senators in this film are types rather than people. Gracchus is witty and principled, and is given 2 speeches about Rome that both land well, but he is a function, not a person. And the mechanics of the conspiracy itself, how information moves between the palace and the Senate and the arena and the cities underground, are gestured at rather than dramatized. When the plan falls apart, it falls apart because the screenplay decides it should, rather than because we have been watching a system under strain that we could plausibly believe might fail this particular way. The political thriller at the heart of Gladiator's second half is underpowered relative to the emotional thriller of Maximus's grief and survival, and the disproportion between them is occasionally jarring. The character of Lucius Lucilla's son, who forms an attachment to Maximus and who watches the games from the imperial box with a child's uncomplicated hero worship, is set up as though he will matter in a specific way to the story and then is mostly used as leverage rather than as a human being. The film clearly wants us to feel that Maximus's connection to this boy is meaningful, that Lucius represents something about the future, about children who inherit the Rome their parents build or fail to build, but the thematic weight is never properly distributed through the narrative. Lucius disappears from meaningful presence in the story whenever Commodus's fear of what he represents to Maximus becomes politically inconvenient to dramatize, and the film never quite reclaims him as a significant figure. He is a missed opportunity, a character who could have tied the film's largest themes together at its conclusion and instead simply watches the ending happen. There are also pacing concerns in the film's middle section that are worth naming. The gladiatorial training sequences in North Africa, the time between Maximus's arrival in Proximo's Crowe, and the move to Rome are handled efficiently but not particularly richly. The film is clearly in transition mode during this stretch, moving its pieces from one location to another. But the emotional potential of that period, Maximus genuinely processing the loss of his family, beginning to rebuild a sense of identity and purpose within the constraints of slavery, forming the friendship with Juba that will matter throughout the rest of the film, is somewhat compressed. The film moves fast where it should move slowly, and slow where it should move fast, in ways that suggest the editorial decisions were driven by the desire to get to Rome rather than by the dramatic logic of the story. The historical liberties the film takes are worth mentioning briefly, not as a criticism exactly. Historical drama is not documentary, and the expectation of accuracy in a film of this kind would be both unreasonable and beside the point, but because some of them create specific narrative credibility problems that are distinct from the question of historical accuracy. The most significant is the gladiatorial system itself, which in reality was considerably more complex, regulated, and organized than the film depicts. Gladiators in the actual Roman world were expensive commodities, not disposable cannon fodder, and the economics of the arena were quite different from what the film shows. More narratively relevant is the character of Commodus himself, who in actual history was indeed something of an unhinged emperor, but whose specific actions and personality were quite different from Phoenix's portrayal. The historical Commodus actually did fight in the arena himself, apparently quite frequently, a detail that might have added an interesting layer to the film's final confrontation but which the movie doesn't use. These aren't indictments, they're just the places where the film's creative choices show their seams. And finally, the ending. Not the emotional content of the ending, which I will cover in the spoiler section, but the structural choice to resolve the entire political dimension of the story through a single arena fight. The film has spent 2.5 hours establishing a political crisis, the illegitimacy of Commodus's rule, the Senate's desire for republican government, the people's attachment to Maximus, and it resolves all of that through physical combat between two individuals, which is emotionally satisfying in the visceral sense but is also somewhat evasive in the political sense. After Commodus is dead, Rome presumably continues. The Senate resumes its function. Some senator announces that the slaves who served as gladiators are free. But the film doesn't show us what Rome looks like after. It doesn't grapple with the question of who leads, or whether the republic Marcus Aurelius dreamed of is actually achievable, or what the cost of everything that happened actually means for the people who are not Maximus and Commodus. The film earns its ending emotionally. It doesn't entirely earn it politically. And for a film that has spent so much time gesturing toward large ideas about power and governance and legacy, it is a slightly smaller ending than the ambition of the story warranted. But I want to be clear, these are the criticisms of a film I take seriously. They are the criticisms that emerge from engagement rather than dismissal. Gladiator is flawed in specific identifiable ways, and it is also genuinely alive in ways that many technically perfect films are not. Its failures are the failures of overreach, of a film trying to do more than its script entirely supports. And that kind of failure is in the end more interesting than the smooth, airless success of a film that never tried for anything beyond what it could safely achieve. So we walk through the film, layer by layer. We've looked at what it does brilliantly and where it stumbles. Now we need to do something that almost no one does when they talk about Gladiator. We need to place it back in the world it came from, because a film doesn't exist in a vacuum. It arrives at a specific moment in history into a specific cultural conversation, carrying the weight of everything happening around it. And understanding that context doesn't just explain why Gladiator was received the way it was. It explains what the film was actually doing, beneath all the sand and spectacle, in the culture that produced it and consumed it. So let's pull the camera back. Let's get a wide shot on this film's place in history. Because this layer changes everything. The year 2000 was a peculiar moment for mainstream Hollywood cinema. The decade that had just ended, the 90s, had been defined cinematically by a very specific kind of ambition. Independent film had exploded in cultural influence. Quentin Tarantino, the Coen brothers, Paul Thomas Anderson, a generation of filmmakers who had come up through video store obsession and genre literacy had redefined what mainstream audiences expected from popular film in terms of intelligence and self-awareness. At the same time, the blockbuster machine had reached new extremes of scale and spectacle. Titanic had become the highest-grossing film in history in 1997. The Phantom Menace had landed in 1999 with perhaps the most anticipation ever attached to a single film release, and left a significant portion of the audience strangely deflated. The Matrix, Also, 1999 had genuinely reconfigured what action cinema could look like and think about. By the year 2000, the cinematic landscape was a strange hybrid. Audiences simultaneously craving spectacle and intellectual engagement, wanting their blockbusters to mean something, wanting their visual experiences to be genuinely substantive rather than merely loud. Into this moment walked Gladiator. And what is remarkable in retrospect is how precisely it answered the specific cultural hunger of that exact moment. It gave audiences the spectacle they wanted, the scale, the arena sequences, the visceral impact of the battle sequences, but it wrapped that spectacle around a story that was at its emotional core extremely simple and extremely human. A man who has lost everything and wants to go home, or, if he cannot go home, to reach the one who comes after this life and find there what was taken from him here. That combination, the spectacular container carrying the simple human content, was exactly what audiences in the year 2000 were looking for, even if they couldn't have articulated it before they walked into the theater. But there is a deeper cultural current worth tracing because Gladiator was not just a film about a Roman general. It was, in a way that audiences responded to intuitively and critics articulated afterward, a film about a very specific late 20th century anxiety about power, spectacle, and the corruption of public life. The late 90s had been an era of extraordinary political theater in America. The Clinton impeachment saga had consumed the last years of the decade, and what it had produced was a public disillusionment with institutions, a widespread feeling that the machinery of power was fundamentally performative, that the people at the top were actors in a drama of their own devising, that the spectacle of governance had replaced the substance of it. Commodus, the emperor who cannot earn genuine love, and so manufactures popularity through bread and games, who uses spectacle as a substitute for legitimacy, landed in that cultural moment with an accuracy that felt almost prophetic to some audiences and critics. And then there was the broader anxiety about empire itself. America in the year 2000 was at the height of what felt like an almost unassailable cultural and economic dominance, the end of history, as one political scientist had famously and prematurely declared it. The Roman Empire as a metaphor for American power was not a new idea, but it was one that Gladiator made newly accessible and newly visceral. The film's opening credits, placing us in the Roman Empire at its height, with the text noting that at that moment Rome controlled 1/4 of the world's population, did not land neutrally in a culture simultaneously proud of and made anxious by its own imperial reach. Marcus Aurelius's dying hope that Rome could be something other than an empire, that it could return to the republic it had once been, to governance by principle rather than by power, resonated in ways that went beyond the historical. People heard something in that hope that applied to the world they were actually living in. That is what it means for a film to catch a cultural moment. Not that it makes topical references or deliberate allegories. That it tells a story that rhymes with something the audience is already feeling. The critical reception of Gladiator when it opened in May of 2000 was generally positive but noticeably divided between those who responded to its emotional and visual ambition and those who found its narrative architecture too rickety to bear the weight being placed on it. Roger Ebert, one of the most influential film critics in American culture at the time, gave the film 4 out of 4 stars and wrote about it in terms that emphasized its almost primal cinematic power, its ability to make you feel things on a level that bypassed analytical evaluation. He called it a triumph of spectacle and human feeling, and his review captured something real about the experience of watching the film for the first time, particularly in a cinema, where its scale and sonic architecture produced an almost overwhelming physical response. Other critics were less convinced or were convinced by different things. Several noted what I discussed earlier: the thinness of the political subplot, the underuse of Lucilla, the somewhat mechanical workings of the revenge narrative in the second half. Anthony Lane in The New Yorker, characteristically precise and pleasurably sharp, appreciated the film's visual achievements and Phoenix's performance enormously while expressing skepticism about the screenplay's ability to support the emotional claims being made through the film's more spectacular elements. The criticism that recurred most consistently among the most skeptical reviews was a version of the same observation that Gladiator is a film of extraordinary surfaces housing a somewhat thin interior. That you could be swept away by it in the cinema and left feeling, in the cold light of afterward, that the depth you experienced was partly the film's and partly your own projection onto it. That divergence between the sweep of the emotional experience and the structural limitations of the screenplay is exactly the tension I have been trying to describe throughout this breakdown. And it is worth noting that both sides of that critical divide were, in their own way, correct. Gladiator does sweep you away, and Gladiator is, in places, built on a scaffold that is not as sturdy as what it supports. Both things are true simultaneously, and the film's legacy is the product of that specific combination. What is less ambiguous is the audience response. Gladiator opened to enormous commercial success. It earned over $400 million worldwide in its theatrical run, a massive number in 2000. But more interesting than the opening weekend numbers is the shape of its theatrical run. It held exceptionally well over multiple weeks, suggesting that word of mouth was driving people back and drawing in audiences who hadn't seen it opening weekend. Films that hold well like that tend to be films that people feel they need to tell someone else about. Films that have done something to them that they want to share. Gladiator was that kind of experience for a lot of people. Not just a film you saw, a film you pressed on other people. That is the signature of a film that has touched something real in the culture. The award cycle that followed the film's release in 2000 was one of the more fascinating and genuinely contentious in recent Oscar history. Gladiator entered the race as a frontrunner largely on the strength of its box office and cultural impact, and it departed the ceremony having won 5 awards, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Russell Crowe. The competition for Best Picture that year was particularly strong. The other nominees included Ridley Scott's own film in direct competition with Erin Brockovich, Chocolat, Billy Elliot, and perhaps most significantly, Steven Soderbergh's Traffic, which many film critics considered the superior film. Traffic was a formally innovative, politically sophisticated, genuinely challenging work about the American drug war, and its loss to Gladiator provoked some of the strongest critical responses in either direction. The case for Gladiator deserving Best Picture is essentially the case I have been building throughout this breakdown, that it is a genuinely significant popular film that achieved its ambitions in ways that matter, that it restored the epic to cultural legitimacy, and that it contains performances and sequences of real artistic distinction. The case against, made most forcefully by critics who preferred Traffic, was that the Academy had rewarded spectacle over substance, that the historical epic's return to cultural respectability did not require the conferral of the medium's highest honor, and that Gladiator's structural weaknesses disqualified it from the very top tier it was being placed in. What I find most interesting about that debate is not which side was right. These are not the kinds of arguments that have right answers, but what it reveals about what audiences and industry voters were doing with Gladiator. They were responding to the experience of the film as much as the film itself. They were rewarding the feeling of being in the cinema, watching those Colosseum sequences, with the music building and Russell Crowe's presence filling the screen. They were saying collectively that a film which could produce that experience in that many people was doing something worth celebrating. And I think that is a defensible position, even if I personally would not have placed Gladiator above Traffic in that particular year. Russell Crowe's Best Actor win is interesting to evaluate with the distance of time. His performance is genuinely extraordinary in the ways I have described. The physical and emotional intelligence, the specificity of the grief, the control power of the presence. But Crowe had made a different and arguably more demanding film earlier that year, The Insider, directed by Michael Mann, in which he played a corporate whistleblower in an internally complex, dramatically quieter performance that many critics considered more purely impressive as acting. The prevailing opinion among serious film historians and critics is that Crowe probably deserved the Best Actor award for The Insider for the year before, and that Gladiator was in some sense the Academy correcting a previous oversight, which may or may not be how award should work depending on your philosophy. What is not in dispute is that the performance in Gladiator is a significant one, and that the award was not undeserved even if the specific timing of it carries a slightly complicated history. Joaquin Phoenix, who delivers what I have described as the film's most psychologically rich and technically sophisticated performance, was nominated for Best Supporting Actor and did not win, losing to Benicio del Toro for Traffic, which is interesting given the competition. Phoenix's loss is one of those Oscar outcomes that has aged particularly poorly, not because Del Toro's performance was undeserving, but because time has continued to reveal the depth and lasting power of what Phoenix built in Gladiator. Is Commodus has become one of those performances that other actors and directors cite as a reference point, a standard against which certain kinds of character work is measured. The Academy in 2001 did not give him this statue. History has given him something more durable than a statue. It has made his performance in this film canonical. Hans Zimmer and Lise Gerard won the Golden Globe for Best Original Score, but were not nominated for the Academy Award. A strange and widely criticized omission that reflected a complicated eligibility dispute about how much of the score was original versus derived from Zimmer's earlier work on other projects. The technical details of that dispute are less interesting than the cultural outcome, which is that one of the most emotionally influential scores in mainstream cinema of the last 25 years was shut out of the award it almost certainly would have won, in a year when most people would have argued it had the clearest case of any element of any nominated film for recognition in its category. The music of Gladiator has outlasted that oversight entirely. You hear the opening notes of the main theme, and it produces an immediate, almost involuntary emotional response in anyone who experienced the film in the years around its release. That is what great film music does. It becomes inseparable from the emotional memory of the work. The film's streaming life and second wave discovery deserve particular attention because Gladiator is one of those films that has found each successive generation of film lovers somewhat independently, and each generation has found slightly different things in it worth responding to. The initial audience responded to the spectacle and the emotional sweep, the cathartic power of the revenge narrative, the almost mythological simplicity of the hero's journey. A second wave of viewers, finding the film on DVD and later on early streaming platforms in the mid-2000s, began to pay more attention to Commodus, to Phoenix's performance specifically, and the critical conversation around the film shifted toward the villain rather than the hero. Forums and early film websites spent considerable energy on exactly the kind of psychological analysis of Commodus that I've been doing here, and that conversation helped cement the view that the film's most interesting character was the one who lost. In more recent years, a third wave of engagement with Gladiator has emerged, connected in part to the renewed critical attention paid to the film in anticipation of and following the release of Ridley Scott's sequel, Gladiator 24. That renewed engagement has been noticeably more gender conscious than earlier waves of reception, more attentive to the systematic underuse of Lucilla, more interested in what the film's treatment of its female characters says about the storytelling values of mainstream Hollywood at the turn of the millennium, and more willing to name those gaps as failures rather than simply accepting them as the genre's conventions. The shift in critical consciousness says something interesting not just about Gladiator but about how our frameworks for evaluating films evolve over time. The film has not changed. What we bring to it has changed. And some of what we now bring to it makes certain of its choices look less acceptable than they once did. Does Gladiator feel timeless or perfectly of its era? This is one of the most genuinely interesting questions you can ask about any film that achieved major cultural impact, and Gladiator's answer is more complex than a simple either-or. Certain elements of it feel genuinely outside of time. The core emotional architecture, the father-son dynamics at the film's psychological center, the primal simplicity of the revenge narrative, the quality of the best performances. These things too noted because they are built on something universal. Loss is universal. The hunger for a man to be seen as worthy by his father is universal. The corruption of power by the need for approval is universal. These emotional truths were old when Rome was young, and they will still be true when every visual effect in this film has aged into anachronism, and some of it does feel very specifically of the year 2000, in ways that are neither a criticism nor a compliment, simply an observation. The action editing style, the undercranking, the brief, highly kinetic cuts, was of its precise historical moment. You can trace that style forward and backward to films of the late 90s and early 2000s. It felt innovative in 2000 and feels slightly dated now in the specific way that all innovative techniques eventually did once they have been absorbed and copied and surpassed. The digital effects in certain Colosseum sequences, which were remarkable for their time and remain impressively credible in the arena's principal geometry, show their age in the peripheral detail work in ways that a film made today would not. The score paradoxically does not date in the same way, because music that bypasses visual representation and goes directly for emotional response is less vulnerable to the passage of time than images. The images age, the music does not. So Gladiator is both timeless and of its era, in different registers and in different proportions. The emotional core is permanent, the technical surface is historical, and that combination is in the end fairly common among the films that endure. What makes a film last is not the technology it deploys but the human truth it carries. And Gladiator carries enough of that to remain in the conversation, even in a world that has had 25 years to produce things that exceed it technically. Now, let's go deeper than the story. Let's go beneath the surface of what happens and get to what the film is actually about. Because the story of Gladiator, the revenge narrative, the political conspiracy, the arena, is the container. What the container holds is something more interesting and more personally resonant than the plot summary suggests. And this is the layer that I think most people who've seen the film have felt without being able to fully name. So let me try to name it. Gladiator is a film about identity. Specifically, it is a film about what happens to a man when everything that has defined him is stripped away, and the question that remains is, who are you now? Maximus is defined at the beginning of this film by his role as general, his role as husband and father, his role as the man Marcus Aurelius trusted above all others, even above his own blood. These are not shallow definitions. They are the architecture of a self. They are the answer a man gives when someone asks him who he is. And in a single night, every one of those definitions is erased. The general becomes a slave. The husband and father becomes a man standing in the ash of what his family was. The trusted servant becomes the prisoner of the man he was supposed to replace. What is left? The film's answer, and I think it is the right answer and a genuinely meaningful one, is this. What is left is the core, the irreducible thing, the part of a man that is him regardless of rank or title or role. And the film argues that Maximus's core, the thing that remains when everything else is gone, is a form of love. Not romantic love, not the love of an emperor for his subject, the love of a man for what he has lost, the love that refuses to reduce the dead to their absence, the love that maintains, even in impossible conditions, the specific memory of specific people, a wife's hands, a son's running gait, the wheat field in the Spanish morning, the figurines, the private ritual of remembering. That is who Maximus is when you take everything else away. He is a man who loves his dead, and who refuses to stop loving them even when that love is the most painful thing he carries. This connects to a second theme that the film handles with more delicacy than it is usually given credit for, the relationship between grief and purpose. Maximus does not, as I noted in the story walkthrough, have a clear and singular revenge motive from the moment of his family's death. He has grief. The revenge emerges from the grief, but it is not the same as the grief. And what the film is tracking through the long middle section in the arena is the way grief gradually transforms, how it finds shape and direction, how the energy of loss slowly organizes itself into something that can move forward. Maximus becomes the Spaniard, the general who plays to the crowd, not because he chooses a persona strategically, but because the arena demands that something fill the space that was once occupied by his actual life. The gladiator is what grows in the soil of what the man used to be. And there is something genuinely insightful in that. The observation that people who have lost everything do not simply become nothing, they become different versions of themselves, organized around the loss, shaped by it, sometimes entirely new in ways they could never have predicted. The film also carries a coherent and quietly powerful meditation on the nature of power and what it does to the people who hold it. Commodus is not the only figure in this film who exercises power badly. Marcus Aurelius exercised it with wisdom and restraint. And yet, the fundamental act of his final days, the decision to pass power to Maximus rather than his own blood, was itself an act of profound human failure. Not political failure, human failure. He chose the more qualified man over his own son without apparently considering what that choice would communicate to his son about his worth. He prioritized the good of Rome over the good of Commodus, and while that prioritization is politically defensible and even admirable, it is also the direct cause of everything terrible that follows. The best intentions in public life, the film is saying, do not exempt us from the consequences of our private failures. Marcus Aurelius can have all the virtues of a philosopher king and still be a bad father, and a bad father, in this case, produced a catastrophically bad emperor. The public and the private are not separate systems, they are the same system expressed at different scales. And then there is the Colosseum itself, not just as a setting but as a symbol. The arena in Gladiator is not simply a place where people fight. It is a representation of something specific about the relationship between power, entertainment, and truth. The arena is where the culture puts its violence so that it can be both present and contained, witnessed but managed, experienced but at a safe institutional remove. Commodus uses the arena for political purposes. Proximo uses it for commercial purposes. The crowd uses it for emotional release, the specific pleasure of watching consequence without experiencing it. And Maximus, the one person in the arena who has no choice about being there, is the only one for whom the arena is genuinely real. His violence is not performance, his grief is not entertainment. His presence in that space is involuntary, while everyone else's presence in it is chosen. And that distinction between the chosen witness and the compelled participant is the ethical core of the film's entire arena metaphor. We are all, the film is suggesting, in the stands. We are all watching someone else's real suffering framed for our entertainment. The question the film asks, the question Maximus asks the crowd with that bitter, bone-tired line about entertainment, is whether we have the capacity to feel the weight of that. Whether the spectacle we consume can ever reach back through the screen and ask something of us. That question resonates beyond the Roman arena. It resonates in a world of 24-hour news cycles and social media and streaming platforms where genuine human suffering is constantly being packaged and delivered to audiences who consume it in the same relaxed posture they use for everything else. Are we not entertained? It is a bitter question in the film. Outside the film, it is a haunting one. There is also a specific and quietly radical thing the film does with masculinity that is worth naming, because it runs against the grain of what you might expect from a film about a Roman gladiator. The emotional truth of Gladiator is not about strength, it is about vulnerability. Maximus is defined not by his invincibility, but by his capacity for loss. He is Moss himself, not when he is winning, but when he is grieving, when he is in the ruins of the farm, when he is watching Cicero die, when he is alone with the figurines in the dark. The film is deeply interested in what a man looks like when he is broken, and it treats that brokenness not as weakness but as the most honest and human form of strength, the refusal to pretend that nothing touches you, the willingness to carry pain without performing either stoicism or drama. Crowe's performance achieves this because it refuses both. He is not stoic, he is not dramatic, he is simply wounded all the time and functional anyway. And that combination, wounded and functional, weaving and still moving, is what the film holds up as the truest expression of what a man can be. The film's vision of the afterlife, the wheat field, the gate, the reunion, is also worth examining as a genuine statement of belief rather than simply a narrative device. Gladiator is not a Christian film and it makes no pretense of being one. Its spiritual world is pagan Roman, the Elysian fields, the idea that the honored dead go to a place of peace and continuation. But the specific texture of Maximus's vision of that place is profoundly personal rather than institutional. His afterlife is not the Roman Elysium of epic poetry, not a golden hall or a place of heroic assembly. It is his farm, his specific, particular, ordinary farm in Spain, with a wooden gate and the afternoon light and a specific child running toward him. His afterlife is the life he was denied. His heaven is the life he lost. And there is something deeply moving in that specificity, the insistence that what matters is not the grand and the mythological but the small and the personal, the wheat, the gate, the boy. These are the things worth dying for. These are the things worth living through everything to reach. The film's spirituality is essentially the spirituality of love, the belief that what you love most is what waits for you, and that death is the door between the life you had and the life you were reaching for. Now let me connect all of this to something in your own life, because that is the whole point of this deeper layer, not to give you a lecture about Roman history or film theory, but to show you where the film's truth touches actual human experience. We have all lost things. Not always as catastrophically as Maximus. Of us will not lose a family to an emperor's jealousy, but we have all experienced the specific vertigo of losing a definition of ourselves. The job that ended, the relationship that dissolved, the version of yourself that you were for years and then suddenly weren't anymore. And what Gladiator is asking, underneath all the spectacle and the armor and the sand, is what you do with that. How you go on being yourself when the context that made sense of you has been removed. Whether the core of you, the part that loved, the part that connected, the part that built something with other people, survives the loss of its external structures. And the film's answer is not triumphant in the way you might expect from a Hollywood epic. It doesn't say that you rebuild. It doesn't say that you find purpose and channel grief into achievement. It says something quieter and stranger and more honest than that. It says that sometimes you carry the loss all the way to the end. That some losses don't transform into something cleaner and more useful. That Maximus never stops being a man in grief. Not in the arena. Not at the moment of his revenge. Not in his final breath. He is a man in grief who keeps moving. And that distinction between transformation and endurance is one that anyone who has experienced real loss will recognize immediately and viscerally. You don't get over it, you get through it. Those are not the same thing. And Gladiator almost accidentally, almost against the genre conventions it is working within, tells the truth about that. That is what this film is really about. Not glory, not revenge, not the fall of empires or the restoration of republics. It is about a man who loves his dead and refuses to stop, and who moves through a world that has no place for that love until he finds the one door it can walk through. That's the box inside the box. And now you have it. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now. Go watch it and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. So, everything is on the table. Let's go through the film's major revelations, hidden layers, and ending with the kind of granular attention that a first watch simply cannot accommodate. Because Gladiator, for all its apparent directness as a narrative, is a film that plants things carefully and pays them off in ways that are easy to miss until you've been given the map. The first thing I want to do is go back to the very beginning, not the battle, not the wheat field dream, but the absolute first image of the film. Before any of the action, before the titles, there is a hand moving through wheat, golden light, stillness, A man walking slowly through a field, his fingertips trailing along the tops of the stalks, and the sun warm on everything. It lasts only seconds before the film cuts to the cold blue of Germania. But those seconds are the most important images in the entire film, because they are not a memory, not yet. They are a vision, a thing that has not yet happened but that is already present in the film's consciousness as the destination. You are being shown in the very first images where the story is going, not where it starts, where it ends. The wheat field is the first and last image of the film. The journey of Gladiator, the entire arc from the battle to the arena to the death, is the distance between that first brief glimpse of the field and the full arrival at it in the final moments. The film begins and ends in the same place, and on first viewing you don't know that. The wheat field in those opening seconds seems like a detail, a character trait, a man who loves his farm. It is actually the entire story told in a gesture. Pay attention on a rewatch to the specific quality of light in the wheat field sequences. The film has a cinematographic language for Maximus's visions of home that is entirely distinct from its visual language for everything else. As where in the film, light is specific and realistic. The cold blue-gray of the Germanic forest, the warm gold of Roman buildings, the harsh near-white of the North African sun. But in the wheat field sequences, the light has a quality that is slightly too beautiful to be natural, slightly too warm, slightly too still. It is the light of memory rather than of experience. The way a specific beloved place lives in the mind of someone who has lost access to it, more luminous than any photograph could capture because it carries not just the image but the feeling of safety. And that visual distinction between the real light of the world Maximus is forced to inhabit and the remembered light of the world he is always reaching back toward is maintained with absolute consistency throughout the film. Every time you see that quality of light, you know where Maximus actually is, even when he is standing in the middle of Rome. The figurines of his wife and son deserve extended attention as a narrative and symbolic device. On first watch, they register as a touching character detail, a man who keeps the only physical remnants of his family close. On a closer look, they are doing much more structural work than that. The figurines are carved, not purchased, not found, but made by hand, which means Maximus made them. Which means in whatever spare hours the general has between campaigns, this man carved figures of his wife and his son and carried them with him into war. That is not a thing you do casually. That is the act of a man for whom separation from his family is the primary emotional fact of his existence, who has found a way to carry them with him literally when he cannot carry them any other way. These small objects represent a practice of love, the maintenance of connection across distance and absence. And when that practice is all he has left, when the people they represented are gone, the objects become not comfort but wound. He keeps them anyway. He keeps them because stopping the practice would be a second loss on top of the first. Watch the way the figurines are held in different scenes. Early in the film, in the moments before the Germania battle, when Maximus is shown briefly touching them, he holds them loosely, easily, the way you hold something familiar and beloved, something that is simply part of you. After the loss in the arena sequences, he holds them differently, with a specific care that is also a kind of urgency, as though they might disappear if he doesn't hold them tightly enough. The physical relationship with the objects tracks the emotional journey without a single line of dialogue being required. And when Druba buries them in the Colosseum sand at the film's end, placing them where Maximus fell, returning them to the earth where the man himself now is, the gesture closes the loop on everything those objects have been carrying. They were the connection to the lost family, and now the man who carried them has joined the family he was carrying them toward. They don't need to be carried anymore. They can be placed. The journey is over. Now let's talk about Commodus and the specific psychological architecture of his villainy, because there are details in his character that become considerably richer on a second viewing when you know where everything is going. The key to Commodus on rewatch is the consistency of his need. He needs the crowd. He needs his sister. He needs the army. He needs his father's approval even after his father is dead. He organizes the entire machinery of the empire around the project of getting people to love him, and nothing he acquires, not the throne, not the games, not the people's cheers, satisfies the need, because the need is not actually about love. It is about the specific love of specific people who withheld it. Marcus Aurelius cannot give it to him because Marcus Aurelius is dead by his own hand. Maximus cannot give it to him because Maximus represents the living proof of what he is not. And Lucilla, the one person who does love him, in her own complicated and frightened way, he drives away with the same possessiveness and instability that he brings to every relationship. Commodus is a man who has confused possession for love, performance for intimacy, and admiration for acceptance. And he has been confusing them so long that he has lost the ability to recognize the real thing even when it is present. There is a scene or rewatch that takes on a completely different weight once you understand the full arc. When Commodus descends to the arena after the Battle of Carthage reenactment, when he comes down to face Maximus for the first time, surrounded by his soldiers in theory holding every advantage, watch his hands. Watch how he moves. He is, beneath the imperial purple and the armed escort, afraid. He is facing a man who knew him before he was emperor, a man who saw his father prefer him, a man who represents a standard of character that Commodus measured himself against and lost every time. And in that moment, before the exchange of names, before the declaration of intent, there is a pause where you can see Commodus calculating whether he can simply have Maximus killed, right there, in front of everyone, and what it would cost him. And the calculation comes out against the killing, not because he has mercy, but because the crowd is watching, and the crowd loves this gladiator, and the cost of public murder in this context is too high. He is a man who cannot even satisfy his own murderous impulse without first checking it against the crowd's approval. That is the specific cage he has built for himself. Power without legitimacy is not power, it is performance, and he knows it. The moment of Commodus's death is something I want to examine in detail, because it is handled with a restraint that I think is cinematically correct and emotionally true in ways that are easy to underestimate. After the long fight, the exhausted, grinding, increasingly desperate combat between a dying man and an emperor, Maximus gets his hand on the hidden blade. He does what he came back from the dead to do, and he does it not with triumph, but with effort, with everything that is left. And then he falls. He does not stand over his enemy in victory. He does not deliver a final pronouncement. He simply falls, the way a body falls when it has done what it was required to do and has nothing left. And he begins to go somewhere else. He begins the last walk toward the light. Here is the detail that most people miss in those final moments, and it is the most important hidden layer in the entire film. Maximus's final instructions, given from the ground to those around him, are for Rome. Free the gladiators. Restore the Senate. Honor Marcus Aurelius's dream. These are political acts. These are the instructions of a man fulfilling a mandate. But the last thing he does, the last voluntary action of his body before it stops, is close his hand around something. Look at what he is holding. He is not holding a sword. He is not holding a symbol of power. He is holding air. He is reaching for the hand of his wife in the vision, the hand that is already there, in the light, in the wheat field, reaching back for him. His final gesture is not political and not martial. It is personal. The empire gets his last words. His family gets his last touch. That is the hierarchy of value the film has been building toward from the first second of its runtime. And it is delivered not in dialogue but in the specific physical gesture of a man's closing hand. The scene after Maximus dies, the Colosseum emptying, the senators carrying his body out with something approaching reverence, Lucilla's quiet declaration that he was a soldier of Rome, is deliberately underpopulated with music in its first moments. The absence of the score is as significant as its presence throughout the rest of the film. Silence here is the sound of a world that has lost something it will not replace. And then, gradually, quietly, the music returns, not the driving rhythmic urgency of the battle themes, but Gerard's voice, just barely pleasant at first, growing slowly into the full now and we are free theme. The transition from silence to music tracks the transition from the world of the living, where Maximus suffered, to the world of the wheat field, where he arrives. And the timing is precise. The music fully blooms at the exact moment Juba says, alone on the sand, that they will meet again, but not yet, not yet. The score confirms what Juba's faith asserts. He will. This is not a platitude. This is the Finn's genuine spiritual position. Death in Gladiator is not an ending, it is a door, and the music knows which side of the door we are on. Juba's final scene deserves extended attention because it is the film's most quietly devastating moment and the one that most viewers don't fully sit with. He is alone in the Colosseum, the arena that has been the context for everything, the spectacle, the violence, the politics, the emotional climax of the film is now empty. The architecture of Rome's appetite for performance stands silent and enormous around one small man kneeling in the sand. He digs a small hole with his hands. He places the figurines in it, the wife, the son, the small carved objects that Maximus carried through everything, and he covers them, and he speaks. He says to the ground, to the buried figures, to the absent presence of the man who carried them, that he will see him again, but not yet. Not yet, not yet. Those two words, not yet, carry the entire emotional weight of the surviving person's grief. The acknowledgement that reunion is real, is promised, is coming, but is not now, and that the not now is the hardest part, not the impossibility of reunion. The distance until it arrives. Juba will live his own life, find his own way back to his family, carry his own losses and his own days. And somewhere at the end of that, the not yet becomes now. The film never shows us that moment. It doesn't need to. The promise of it, spoken into sand, in an empty arena by a man alone, is enough. The post-credit scene, there is none. This is worth saying explicitly because Gladiator was made in an era before post-credit scenes became an expectation, and its ending is entirely the better for having the courage to simply end. The final image before the credits roll is the wheatfield vision, Maximus walking, the gate ahead, his son. The film closes on the thing it opened on. The journey is complete, the box is closed, and the decision not to continue past that, not to show us Rome's political aftermath, not to show us Lucilla's fate or Lucia's future, is a deliberate and correct artistic choice. What matters is not the institutional aftermath. What matters is the human completion, the wheat field, the gate, the boy. Now let me tell you my genuine personal reaction to the film's ending, because that's what this channel is built on. Real responses from a real person who sat with this film and let it do what it does. I expected to be moved by their arena fight. I was not particularly, not because it isn't well constructed, but because by that point in the film I had already identified the emotional truth I was waiting for, and it wasn't the killing of Commodus. I expected to be moved by Maximus's death, and I was, but not in the way I expected. What moved me was not the death itself, it was the hand. The closing hand reaching for his wife in the vision. That specific, small, private gesture in the middle of all that sand and stone and political significance, that closed hand reaching for someone only he could see, was the moment the film reached back through the screen and got me, because I understood in that gesture what the whole film had been about. Not Rome, not revenge, not power or its absence. A man reaching for his wife's hand. That is the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing in the world simultaneously. And in a film that is almost relentlessly spectacular in its ambitions, the moment of genuine emotional arrival is a man's hand closing on air. And then Juba alone on the sand, and not yet. Not yet. And I sat with that for a long time after the film ended. Not yet is such a specific and honest thing to say about grief. It is not denial. It is not despair. It is not the clean transcendence of someone who has fully accepted loss. It is the in between, the living in time that all surviving people must do, day after day, accumulating the days between the loss and the reunion, patient and faithful and genuinely uncertain how many more days there will be. Not yet. I think about that phrase. I think it is one of the most quietly true things a film about grief and love has ever said. My rating, and you've known it since we opened the box, is 5.8 out of 10. And I want to explain one more time, now that you had the full experience of the breakdown, why that number sits where it does. Because it is not a dismissal and it is not damning with faint praise. It is an honest accounting. The film I have described contains genuine greatness in Phoenix's Commodus, in Crowe's embodied grief, in Scott's visual architecture, in Zimmer and Gerard's score, in the hand reaching for the wife and Juba alone on the sand. These things are real achievements. They belong in the conversation about cinema. And the film I have described also contains real failures. The underwritten Lucilla, the mechanical conspiracy, the narrative mechanics that creak under the weight being placed on them. And my 5.8 is the honest sum of those things. Not a balanced average, a genuine personal reaction to a film that moves me in specific, identifiable, irreplaceable ways and falls short of me in other specific, identifiable ways. Both things are true. Both things get to be true. That is what honest film criticism looks like when you take the mythology off and look at the film itself. So here we are, the final layer, the verdict. And I want to give it to you the way I give everything on this channel, directly, honestly, without softening the edges or inflating the praise. Because you came here for the truth of this film, and you've earned it by sitting through everything we've just opened together. My personal rating for Gladiator is 5.8 out of 10. And I want you to understand exactly what that number means and exactly what it doesn't mean. Because a number without context is just a number, and context is the whole business of this channel. 5.8 means I respect this film enormously in specific places and feel genuinely let down by it in others. It means that the ceiling of what Gladiator achieves is higher than most films with better scores ever reach. The performance at its center, the score, the visual architecture, the specific emotional truth of a man reaching for his dead wife in his final breath. These things belong in the conversation about genuinely great filmmaking. And it means that the flaw of what Gladiator fails to do is lower than a film with this much talent and this much ambition and this much cultural real estate should allow. Lucilla should have been a full character. The political conspiracy should have been dramatized rather than summarized. The screenplay should have been finished before the cameras rolled. That gap between the ceiling and the floor is where the 5.8 lives, not in the middle of those extremes, exactly in the honest space between them. 5.8 means this film made me feel something real and also made me frustrated by how much more it could have made me feel if it had done the work its best moments demanded of it. Now, who should watch this film? Let me be specific, because the answer is not simply everyone, and the answer is not simply cinephiles, and the answer is definitely not simply fans of the genre. You should watch Gladiator if you are someone who responds to physical embodied acting, to performers who communicate through the body rather than through dialogue, who locate the emotional truth of a character in posture and stillness and the specific quality of a gaze. Crowe and Phoenix are doing something in this film that rewards that kind of attention enormously, and if you are a person who notices those things, you will find this film endlessly rewatchable at the performance level. You should watch it if you are interested in the specific historical moment of mainstream Hollywood cinema at the turn of the millennium, in what popular film was trying to do and what it was capable of doing and where it fell short of its own ambitions. Gladiator is, in that sense, an important film as well as a significant one. It tells you things about its era that other films of the same period don't quite tell you in the same way. You should watch it if you have experienced real grief. Not the tidy arc-shaped grief of redemption narratives, but the kind that doesn't transform into something useful. The kind you simply carry forward. The kind where the best you can say after a long time is not yet, not yet. This film understands that grief with a specificity that surprised me. It will surprise you too. You should watch it if you are willing to engage with the film critically, to hold the genuine achievements and the genuine failures in the same hand simultaneously, to resist the pressure of cultural mythology that says this is a masterpiece and also resist the contrarian impulse that says it's overrated, and to find the honest truth of the thing in between. Films that reward that kind of engagement are the most interesting films. Gladiator is one of them. Who might not connect with it? If you come to this film primarily as a fan of tight narrative construction, if what you need from a film is the satisfaction of watching a story where every element has been thought through to its full conclusion, where the political threads are as well dramatized as the emotional ones, where the female characters are given the same depth as the male leads, you will likely feel the frustration I felt, and you may feel it more sharply. These screenplay's gaps are real. The underuse of Lucilla is a structural failure, not a stylistic choice. If those things pull you out of films, they will pull you out of this one. If you are someone who needs your heroes to be complex, if you require moral ambiguity at the center of your story rather than at its edges, Maximus may feel too clean for you. He is the most straightforwardly virtuous character in the film. His complexity is emotional rather than moral, which is a different thing. Some people find that satisfying. Some people find it thin. If you are in the second group, you may find the film most interesting when it is focused on Commodus, and you may spend the Maximus-centric sequences waiting for Phoenix to come back. How should you watch it? If you haven't seen Gladiator, find the biggest screen available to you. This is a film that was engineered for cinema, for the specific overwhelming physicality of the large format experience, the sound filling the space around you, the Colosseum sequences filling your entire field of vision. Watching it on the phone is not watching Gladiator, it is watching a description of Gladiator. If cinema is not available, at minimum connect to a television, turn the lights down, and let the sound do what it was designed to do. The Hans Zimmer and Lisa Gerrard score deserves speakers, not earbuds. If you have already seen it, and most of you have, watch it again with everything we've discussed in your head. Watch it for Phoenix's hands in the tent scene. Watch for the quality of light in the wheat field. Watch for the way Crowe holds the figurines before and after the loss. Watch for the specific moment when Commodus's smile stops reaching his eyes. These are the layers underneath the film that your first watch couldn't carry, and they are rich enough to make the second viewing a genuinely different experience from the first. Own this film. Don't rely on a streaming platform's licensing decisions to give you continued access to it. This is the kind of film that belongs in a physical collection, that you return to in different seasons of your life and find different things in, the way you return to certain books. At 25 years old, Gladiator has already proven that it repays that kind of long-term relationship. And the one final line I want to leave you with, the thing that closes this particular box, is this. Gladiator is a film about a man trying to get home, and what it understands, in its bones, more deeply than its screenplay always earns but more truly than most films of its scale ever manage to say, is that home is not a place. It is the specific people you love. It is the hand you reach for in the dark. It is your son running toward you through the afternoon light. It is the ordinary, irreplaceable, completely private geography of attachment. And every idea you survive, every emperor you outlast, every morning you get through when getting through seems impossible, all of it, every single piece of it, is the road between you and that door. You are always on your way home, even when you can't see it, even when everything has told you it's gone. Even at the very end, especially at the very end, the field is there. The gate is open, and someone is running toward you through the light, every fin is a box, and we open this one together. Thank you. Genuinely. If you made it this far in this breakdown, if you sat through the production context and the story walkthrough and the criticism and the deep layer and the full spoiler analysis, you are exactly the kind of film lover this channel exists for. And I don't take that lightly. If this breakdown gave you something, a new way of seeing this film, a detail you hadn't noticed before, a reason to go back and watch it again with different eyes, hit like. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely matters for getting this kind of detailed, honest film analysis to more people who are looking for exactly this. And subscribe because every week on this channel we are opening a new box, going layer by layer, doing exactly what we just did here. No shortcuts, no surface level summaries, just real film analysis for people who love film seriously. And I want to hear from you in the comments, not just whether you liked the film. Tell me this, do you think Gladiator deserved Best Picture in 2001? Or do you think Traffic was robbed? That is the question that splits serious film lovers right down the middle, and I want to know exactly where you stand and why. Make the case. I'll be in the comments reading every single one. The next box we're opening is one that I have been sitting with for a long time, a film that almost no one talks about in the same breath as the great films of its decade, and that I think is quietly one of the most psychologically precise films made in the last 30 years. I'm not giving you the title yet, but if you subscribe and turn on notifications, you will be the first to know when we go in. And trust me, you want to be there for this one. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.